Love that singing. And it's so good to see everybody here this morning. We hope that you do not leave here today with questions unanswered. So if you have anything you'd like to speak with us about, questions about what you hear, questions about life and the things that you have to think about and struggle with, you want someone to pray with you, we're here for you, please let us know. And let's see, for announcements today, today is Michaela's birthday. I'm not aware of any other announcements. Anything that I'm missing coming up? Well then, without further ado, let us please stand together and give our attention to the reading of the Word of God.
The reading today is in 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, 10 to 20. Wherefore David blessed the Lord before all the congregation, and David said, Blessed be thou, Lord God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Thine, O Lord, is greatness, and the power, and the glory, and the victory, and the majesty. For all that is in heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord. And thou art exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come of thee, and thou reignest over all. And in thy hand is power and might, and in thy hand is to make great, and to give strength unto all. Now therefore, our God, we thank thee, and praise thy glorious name. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able to offer so willingly after this sort? For all things come of thee, and of thine own have we given thee. For we are strangers before thee, and sojourners, as were all our fathers. Our days on the earth are as a shadow, and there is none abiding. O Lord our God, all this store that we have prepared to build thee a house for thy holy name cometh of thy hand, and is all thy own. I also, my God, that thou triest the heart and hast pleasure in uprightness. As for me, in the uprightness of mine heart, I have willingly offered all these things, and now have I seen with joy thy people which are present here to offer willingly unto thee. O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel our fathers, keep this forever in the imagination of the thoughts of the heart of thy people, and prepare their hearts unto thee, and give unto Solomon my son a perfect heart, to keep thy commandments, thy testimonies, and thy statutes, and to do all these things, and to build the palace for the which I have made provision. And David said to all the congregation, Now bless the Lord your God. And all the congregation blessed the Lord God of their fathers, and bowed down their heads and worshiped the Lord and the King. Now let us bow our heads to worship the Lord. Heavenly Father, King of kings, I praise your blessed name. Your holy name, yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. Everything in heaven and on earth belongs to you. You are exalted above all, and your kingdom reigns forever. Thank you for every blessing you have given me. All that I have comes from your hand. Help me never forget that I am a steward of your blessings, not their owner. Lord, I come before you with humility. My life is temporary, and everything I possess is temporary, but you remain faithful through all eternity. Amen. May gratitude fill my heart each day, and may my life bring glory to your name. Everything comes from you, and everything belongs to you. Amen. I pray for my family and those I love. Turn their hearts towards you, and help them walk in your ways. Give them desire to honor you in all they do. I offer myself to you today, trusting in your goodness, your power, and your unfailing love. Amen.
Very good. Excellent reading. Thank you. So, That's a little low there. There we go. All right, so we're in First Chronicles, and so I was debating how to do this exactly, because in our Bible, in the Christian Bible, the order of the books, what's called the canonical order, it's not a chronological order by any means. So like we talked about in the New Testament, it's ordered in a very peculiar way, but it really has nothing to do with when they were written or what period of time they cover. Same way with the Old Testament. There's somewhat more of a little bit of a chronological order, but not really. And the order of the Christian Bible is different in the Old Testament than the order of the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. So if you were to get a Hebrew Bible, whether it be in the old scrolls or if you were to get one that's been now bound up, you would find a different order. And in that order, Chronicles is the last book of their Bible. All right, that's the last book. And so I was debating, should we look at it in that order and Chronicles at the end, because it really does make more logical sense. I hope, as you'll see as we go through this book, it's more logical to have Chronicles at the end, really, mainly because it's one of the last books written. And we know it was written after the exile. So remember, Israel has, through the book of Samuel and Kings, we saw how the kings have come, and they've been very evil and unrighteous and ungodly. And over a period of time, finally God turns over the 10 northern tribes, and they get hauled off by the Assyrians. And then later on, Judah and Benjamin are taken captive by the Babylonians. And those are the stories we all know very well. We learned them in Sunday school. That's Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the lion's den. And all of that takes place during the Babylonian exile, where they're hauled off by the Babylonians. And then they come back to the land, and we're going to see all this later on as we go through those prophets that lived in those times and wrote and preached in those times. But they come back from exile, and that's Ezra and Nehemiah, right? That's where Nehemiah and Ezra come back from the Babylonian captivity. They rebuild the walls. They start to rebuild the temple. Chronicles is written after all of that. Now we know that because if you read the first 10, 11 chapters, which are often called the most boring chapters on all of humanity, right? Because all it is endless genealogies. Even Paul thought that. He said to avoid, he didn't want you reading Chronicles. He said to avoid endless genealogies. And he obviously meant just don't read Chronicles. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. He did not mean that. But it is. It's these there's these genealogies. But if you read the genealogies, even if you just like skim through them, you'll see the last ones are post-exile people. So the genealogies are written after the exile, and it brings you all the way up past the Babylonian captivity. So Chronicles, for many people, you read it and you go, "Oh, this is like the boring version of Kings and Samuel," because it is. It's kind of like all these genealogies and stuff, and it seems like it's the sanitized version, because you'll notice, like for instance, Bathsheba and the whole affair and that terrible sin of David, not even mentioned. Doesn't even appear in Chronicles. And Solomon and all his wives and concubines and him kneeling down in pagan temples, not a word. Which is surprising in a way, because of other kings, it goes out of its way to make a big point that he had 4 wives. And he had 12 wives. And you're thinking, well, Solomon had 1,000. And there's not a mention in Chronicles. Not a mention. And so Chronicles looks to be like this sanitized version of the other. But it's not what it is. Not at all. It is a reflective history. So we've gone through the whole time of the kings. They've already lived through it. Everyone that was alive has already died. They've gone through the Babylonian captivity. They've rebuilt the walls. They've rebuilt the temple. And now they're back in the promised land in that time period, and they're thinking back. And they're looking back, and they have, like all histories, they have They have an answer. They have a question, that they want to answer. They have an issue that they want to resolve. They want to connect themselves to the past in a particular way or for a particular purpose. And that's how all history is written. There is no view from nowhere. There's no such thing as an objective history. Every history is about selection and editing. You have to cut things out. I mean, if you were to watch a documentary and they would start talking about the type of toothpaste that the subject of the documentary used, well, you would think, well, maybe this has something meaning. And then you watch the whole thing, you find out it had no meaning, had no connection, right? You watch a documentary on Michael Phelps, where they're only going to talk about the events that they find to be directly related to his Olympic victories. They're going to connect to that. And anything in his life, which are myriad of things in his life that he's done and experienced and people he's met, they're not going to talk about them unless they're somehow connected to what they're focusing on. Well, it's the same thing that's happening in Chronicles. They're not trying to sanitize the story. They're not trying to whitewash it. They're not trying to pretend that David hadn't committed that terrible sin. Because all you have to do, if you want to see about that, is go over to the book that deals with that, which is, right, that's Samuel. And you can just go read it, and you can find out what David did. If they were trying to whitewash it the way many times unbelievers accuse the Bible of doing, well, they would have just changed Samuel also. The ones writing this have total control of the Scriptures. It's not like today where if you go in and you change your copy of the Bible, it changes all the Bibles, right? That is no longer possible. In those days, not everyone had a copy. There's probably only one or two copies at any given time. In fact, we know from the study we did in Kings that there was a whole period of decades where nobody had a copy. They found the one remaining copy in the temple buried. And no one had read it for years and years. So changing the Scriptures and whitewashing out the sins of David and whitewashing out the flaws of Solomon would not have been difficult if that was the purpose. It's one of the things that really should help you have a great deal of confidence in the reliability of the Scriptures and its transmission. That the Scriptures, having every possibility to do this, they did not whitewash anything. For instance, just a very quick aside, you have in the New Testament a very similar scenario. We've talked about this a long time ago when we looked at Mark, but I'll refresh your memory. In Mark, you have the sin of Peter, denying Jesus. This was a very early writing. If you think about it, generally speaking, we don't find out about the flaws of our leaders until much later after they've already died. So I looked it up, and there's like no contemporaneous record of Stalin's faults or crimes. None. Why not? Because it was a state crime to criticize Stalin. If you go to Korea, you'll probably be hard-pressed, or North Korea, hard-pressed to find a single piece of paper criticizing Kim Jong-un. Why is this? Well, because they won't allow it. It takes many, many decades, sometimes centuries later, before we start looking in and piecing together not only the good things, the heroic things of our leaders, but their shortcomings. But the Bible's not that way. The first records we have are the ones with the errors, the flaws. It's later on, without changing the early sources, they then look at their life in retrospect. Don't mention those because that's already been covered. And look at it as how it pertains to the plan of God and how these things work together and what exactly is happening there. And that's what we find with Peter. And so the Bible doesn't give us an endless rehashing of these people's sins, but it doesn't just gloss over them either. And think about this like this instance with Peter. Peter was very, very important He was very powerful in a certain sense in the early church. If Peter did not want his sins to be well known, he could have very easily suppressed that information. In fact, it's been speculated by Bible scholars that the only way these writers would have gotten that information is if Peter would have given it to them. So Peter is very likely to have actually authorized and insisted on that being recorded. So the Bible does not record history, does not record these events the way everything else does. It does it in a very honest and a very transparent and even brutally honest way, which to me, at least in my opinion, makes the scriptures very reliable as literature. Very reliable. They have every mark of truthfulness, of honesty, of treating things fairly and honestly. So I hope you can see that, and that might help you. This is what's going on in Chronicles. Chronicles is not trying to sweep anything under the rug. In fact, it does not omit all of David's faults. It just omits the ones that aren't germane to the point. Chronicles has a very definite point it's trying to make. I wouldn't even call it a point. It has a question it wants to answer. And it is not going to spend any time on anything that is not germane to that question. And David's sin with Bathsheba simply is not to the point. It just has no bearing on that. And so they omit it, just like any history would do. Any documentary, obviously, omits the vast majority of the subject's life because you simply can't put everything on the screen. It would be a movie that would last longer than that person lived. So obviously you have to edit, and this is what Chronicles is doing. Very simple. Same thing with Solomon, same thing with others. And I say they did not omit everything because they do put in when David numbered the people, which resulted in a terrible catastrophe in Israel, but it's very, very central. It's very central to the point of Chronicles. Okay, so cutting to the chase. What is the point of 1 Chronicles? Now I want to remind you, before we get to that these books, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, they really need to be thought of as single books. Like it's not, we have it divided, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's really just one book. Kings is one book. Chronicles really is one book that's divided. And the division, we're using it because there are subtle differences in these books and how these two volumes of the book, what they do. So we're looking at them that way. But you got to remember, when I'm talking about Chronicles, I am almost always referring to both books put together. And these books have a central question. They have a concern. And that concern is the temple. It is not the kings. They talk about the kings, but they're only talking about them in relationship to the temple. We take the temple for granted, its existence. In fact, we often, I say we, I'm just talking about evangelical Christians, us. We often will just like conflate the tabernacle and the temple as if really they're the same thing. And I realize they served a lot of the same functions. The temple was kind of built off the pattern of the tabernacle. They used the concepts and the general layouts and all of that. And so yes, there's a lot of overlap between the temple and the tabernacle, but these are not the same things at all. And it was certainly not a default position or a given that there would ever have been a temple built. In fact, God, at least as he expresses himself, it's not how God would we would think of God in himself, but as he expresses himself, he's kind of caught off guard. When David suggests, I want to build a temple. It's kind of out of nowhere. See, the kingship, the fact that Israel had a king, that actually was not surprising. In fact, Moses predicted it back way before it happened. He even has a whole section in his code, in his law, legislating how the eventual kings should behave. And you can go back and read Deuteronomy, and there's a whole section of code for the eventuality that there would be a king. But there's no mention, there's no law, there's no thing talking about when you build a temple. That isn't there. It is just taken for granted that the Jews are going to have this tabernacle forever. So when David comes along and Chronicles goes through and explains how this idea is born in the mind of David, and how it begins to take shape, and how God steers it in a direction he finds more appropriate, and how all of this, and so Chronicles is all about that temple. That's what it's all about. Where the idea came from, what the problems were with it, because this was not just like a no-brainer. There's some significant problems with the idea of a temple. Some serious problems. And us modern evangelicals, those problems aren't obvious to us because we generally don't understand what the tabernacle was about, how it came about, what problems they were solving with that tabernacle, and we don't even understand often the relationship between men and God and how that tabernacle mediated and negotiated that relationship. And so all of those things that are very nuanced and require taking the Old Testament very seriously and looking at it very carefully, not just trying to find proof text for the New Testament, but really looking at what's going on in the Old Testament requires all that. Well, that takes a lot of study, a lot of work, a lot of research, and so we just make assumptions. And I get it. Everybody makes assumptions. You have to make assumptions to get to any knowledge. You have to. But we make assumptions that often are incorrect. And that leads us down the wrong path in understanding what's going on here. So let's talk a little bit about the temple and the tabernacle. Try to keep this on what, like they say, on a lower shelf, not get too lost in the weeds on it. But it's very important if you want to understand the Old Testament, which I think you should want to understand the Old Testament. I think it is a tragedy that the Old Testament could disappear, have never existed, and it wouldn't make any difference for the majority of our beliefs, or for the majority of us in our beliefs. That's a tragedy, because the New Testament writers quote extensively from the Old, and that's what when they said the Scriptures, they weren't talking about their writings for the most part. They were talking about the Old Testament writings, okay? And we cannot, I want you to hear me on this, we cannot turn over the Old Testament to those who would turn it into some cartoon version, and they run around trying to keep kosher, thinking that's taking the Old Testament seriously. That isn't. But if they're the only ones that are actually going to read it and talk about it and speak of it, then that's going to be the version that is seen as the serious treatment of it. We need to be taking the Old Testament far more seriously than we have in the past. So I hope that you can stay with me on this. Let's just talk very briefly about the tabernacle and the temple. What is the difference between the two? It's very simple. The tabernacle was a tent that was movable and didn't have a stationary place. So it was a very provisional structure that could be assembled and disassembled. It was kind of like a huge circus tent. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's not as common here in Mexico. When we lived in Mexico, circuses in the old-fashioned, where they show up on a train and they unload all these huge burlap packages and they use elephants to stand it all up. That actually still happened when I lived in Mexico. It's very fascinating to me. And they just show up in the middle of some field, and a bunch of these people, a lot of times were gypsies, and they'd all come out and they'd get their animals out and the elephants and everything, and they'd stand up the poles and stand up the tents, and within a half a day, there was a circus next to your house. And be there for like a week or 2 weeks or whatever. And have all the stuff in it that you think when you see a film on circuses, like for water for elephants or films like that. That's what it was like. Very fascinating. That's kind of how the tabernacle was. The tabernacle was all these animal skins and these poles and staffs and all this stuff. And it was very, very magnificent, and it had gold and it had all these kind of things, but it was all made to collapse and to fold up and to put into boxes and to carry it around. And you would have thought, right, once Israel got to the promised land, they're like, okay, now let's build a... They never did. They just kept using that tent. And they'd been using it for hundreds of years. And that was where the ark was, and that's where you went to meet God, in this movable tent. And it didn't even have a set location. It would just move around. They'd move it around to different places based on different things, good things, bad things, tragedies, victories, all kinds of things, but it would just get moved around, and it just sort of made its way around Israel for the most part. And it generally was not in Jerusalem at all. So that was the tabernacle. Very temporary, provisional, movable thing. The temple was David's idea of saying, let's make it permanent. Let's not have a tent that folds up. Let's actually build a building in one place in Jerusalem, in the capital. It's going to be, it's basically was set up, Jerusalem was kind of ordered and formatted around it the way Washington, D.C. is around the Capitol building. For those that don't know, the White House is not the center. If you look at a layout of Washington, D.C., the White House was not intended to be the center or the focus of government. It's the Capitol building. It's where the Senate and the House meet. That's considered to be the center of power of Washington, D.C. That's how the temple was. It wasn't the palace that was a center, it was the temple. That's why when Ezra and Nehemiah go back to Israel after the captivity, they rebuild the walls and then the temple, not the palace. The temple, that's the focus. And then as whoever's writing Chronicles is looking back and trying to reconnect these people who have been for over 400 years have been in captivity, have lost a lot of their Jewish culture in some ways. Certainly some of them had, right? People like Daniel had kept it, had been real faithful with it, but many of them had sort of floated away from it a little, if not in practice, certainly in mind and in spirit and in memory. I mean, they didn't have like we do documentaries to watch. They didn't have Netflix that they could that they could binge watch, Israel, pre-exile, let's binge watch that, get ready for it again. They didn't have any of that. So that's what they're doing. This is Netflix before Netflix. Right? They're saying this is where all this comes from. Why are you think about it. You're a nation, and an enemy country comes in, an enemy army comes in, hauls you away for 400 years. Your descendants come back to set a nation up, and the first thing they do is build a church. Surely there would be some people questioning, saying, why are we building a church? Why aren't we building fortresses? Why aren't we building a market? Why aren't we building a government building, an army barrack? I mean, why are we building a temple? I'm not sure I understand the reasoning here, right? That's what they might say. Chronicles wants to answer that. Chronicles wants to explain why this temple matters more than any other structure there, where it came from, and why it matters. Because you're not going to read Deuteronomy and find that answer, because it doesn't talk about that. It doesn't mention a temple. It has a tabernacle, but that's different. Okay. So those are the differences between them. So David has this idea, a permanent structure in Jerusalem. And we think, well, why is this significant? It's not that a tent is a pain, or that it's not very glorious, right? And it isn't. Nobody came from far away. Hey, show me your tent. I heard you guys have a fantastic tent. Nobody. But as soon as Solomon finishes the temple, dignitaries from around the world start coming to see it, because it was that magnificent. It was renowned. David had put the last years of his life into hiring architects and storing up stuff and bringing the finest materials from all over, coming into truce agreements with a lot of foreign nations so that when it came time to build, they were going to have logistics ready to ship in the finest materials. This was the finest building in that time that anyone had ever seen. And it was the weirdest, most amazing thing in the world, because it wasn't like any pagan temple that it ever existed. It was entirely different. Everything about it was different, and it was magnificent and glorious. And it really was. It was an amazing thing. We don't have time to get into it. I'd love to talk about the details. No time. Go and you can read about it. You can read biblically about it, outside the Bible about it, where there's a lot of descriptions. This was a really impressive structure. So this is all there. But there's a lot more to it than that. We got to go back a little bit, if you'll permit me, very quickly. Let's go back and talk about the tabernacle and why it came to be. So to understand the tabernacle, we have to go all the way back to Genesis. Because God made his own temple. God wanted a place where he could meet with his creation. And so he made the Garden of Eden. This was his temple. The tabernacle of the Jews later and the temple that they built have all the elements of Eden in them. They're trying to, in a building, in a tent, with these architectural structures, they are trying to model and to mirror, project the idea of Eden. Because Eden is where God met with his people. That's where God met with creation. That was God's original tabernacle or temple. Well, man sinned, and that got lost. And God made a promise. And the promise was that he would once again one day be among people. We often, evangelicals, get this flipped around in our head. We think the point of salvation is us going to God. But the point of salvation all through the Bible is exactly the opposite. It's God coming to us. Because over and over and over in the Old Testament, God makes this promise that he will once again be with us. That's what, when they dedicate the tabernacle, that's what it means when it was filled with the glory of God. God fills that. So that's the promise coming out of Genesis. Israel comes out of Exodus, they get up to Sinai, and God, in a way, begins to fulfill that promise. Because they're all standing at the mountain, and God is speaking to Moses, but everyone can hear it. And the ground is shaking, and there's deep, pitch black darkness surrounding, and it's just this lightning and voice, and it's this motion, and it's just this incredibly frightening, awesome, scary experience of God's presence right with them. Every single Israelite out of Egypt is standing there experiencing it, and the book of Hebrews says they simply could not tolerate it. It was too much for them. And they asked that God not be so present with them. And you think, why would you? Because everybody who's ever been in the presence of God finds it too frightening. Just look how people act when they get in the presence of one of their pop culture heroes. They start babbling, I love you, man. You can't even think straight. They're so, the adrenaline's flowing just because they meet a movie star or a sports hero. Someone they really admire, someone who has real authority is just like, they just drool all over themselves. And that's just, they're just normal people. They just happen to be good at one little thing. Imagine that God were to come into your life right now in a very real, tangible way. It would terrify you. And you and I, you maybe, I don't know if you, I'll tell you what I would do. I would say, Lord, please not so much. I don't think I want your presence quite like that. And so what does God do? He gives them a tabernacle. He says, I'll tell you what, you're going to build this tent, and I will meet you in the tent. And you'll have representatives who have prepared themselves their whole life to be able to come in and be able to tolerate a few minutes in my presence. And I will meet with the people in this place. And then it'll be able to be moved. And if it gets to be too much, you can just move it around. You can adjust it, and wherever that is, that's where I'll meet with you, and it'll be very safe. And this is the narrative that also we have to get turned the right way in the Bible. The way we often think of the narrative is this: God is so holy that he's just disgusted with us, and he simply cannot even look at us. That is not the biblical story at all. It's the exact opposite. God is not scared of you. He is not, look, he doesn't like the way you live. He doesn't like the way you think. He doesn't like a lot of things about you, but it does not scare him. He's not over there saying, oh, I can't look, oh, my soul. No. It is you who cannot tolerate him. God is not trying to make you more acceptable to him. He's trying to make it where you can accept him. Not by him changing, but by you being transformed into something that can tolerate that level of holiness. And so the tabernacle was kind of a way of a truce where God could meet not everybody, and they wouldn't experience his presence with such total, like this total, intimate, complete presence. They wouldn't say that. It would be mediated through that tabernacle. So David, now we get to David in the Chronicles. So David says, I think we're ready. We're ready for full-on commitment. Now that was probably sanguine of him, but that's what he thinks. We're ready for full-on, full-blown commitment. Think about it this way. You're a young man, you meet a girl you like, or you're a girl, you meet a boy you like. You begin to date. Right? You don't start off by saying, hey, let's go buy a house together. Because you don't know. But as the relationship develops and matures, then you get married, and then you'll move in together, and you need to do it in that order. This is a Christian church. That's not optional. That's the order. Get married, move in together. But you probably won't buy a house together yet, because it takes a great deal of trust in each other to make that kind of commitment. At least in the older days. It's a little less now, but you understand the metaphor, what I'm getting at. But at some point, you're going to say, you know what? Let's invest all of our extra income for the next 30 years in a joint venture. That is saying we are confident this is going to work and last. And we're going to put our money where our mouth is. That's what it means when you buy a house together. You are saying we are going to put every bit of our financial future into this relationship. Total commitment. Total commitment. You didn't know that a house meant that much, but that's what it means. This is what David's doing. He says, no more tent. We're going to take the brakes off the train. We're going to go all in with God. We're going to put him right here in the center of our society, a permanent structure in the middle. Everything's going to focus around that. And we are going to be full on committed. And God warns them. God warns them. He says, I did not ask for this. This is what he tells David. Go and read Chronicles. I didn't ask for this. You don't have to do this. But if you do this, and then you dishonor that house, it is going to be catastrophic for you. The consequence of that will be catastrophic. You better think about this. And of course, as we already saw in Kings, that's exactly what they did. They dishonored that house. And it was catastrophic. So this is what Chronicles is looking at. Why the temple, how it came, but it's also looking at something else. They've rebuilt the temple. right? Where Chronicles is written after the temple has been rebuilt. But it is not the old temple. It is not nearly as magnificent. It's not nearly as glorious. It's not nearly as beautiful. I mean, they've rebuilt it, but, you know, they didn't have the best builders. They didn't have the best materials, and they didn't have access to unlimited funds like Solomon and David had. So they're kind of like cudgeling it together. But they got the temple. But the temple is missing something. And this is the other question they want to talk about. What is it missing? It does not have the presence of God. Remember, when the tabernacle was first made, and they pitched it, and they stood it all up, and they did all, and they purified the Aaron and his sons, and then Aaron and his sons went in and did. When they did that, God's glory filled the tabernacle. God's presence he filled that tabernacle so much that they couldn't even get in the doors. It just filled it. And then when Solomon, we'll find that in 2 Chronicles, you can read it there, but when Solomon actually builds the temple that David has envisioned and prepared for, same thing happens. The glory of God fills the temple. This new temple, rebuilt after the exile, no such thing. In fact, it never happens again. So you have the huge temple that the apostles are looking at in the Gospels, and they're saying, look at this, isn't this amazing? It had never been filled with God's glory. It had been empty ever since. Now here is the underlying narrative of all this. God, in his righteousness, had made a very interesting promise with himself in himself, that he was going to give a true temple to all the nations of the earth. The Jews did everything they could. They kept trying to figure out how they could get God to accept that new temple they had built after the exile, and Herod had rebuilt and enlarged and made it a lot closer to Solomon's beauty. And they kept saying, how could God accept this? And he just never did. In fact, Jesus came and said, not one stone is going to remain upon another. This is not the temple. We've already seen that house doesn't work. And that's what Chronicles is showing us. We take David at his absolute best. We take out almost all of his flaws out of the story. We take Solomon at his absolute best and take all his flaws out of the story. And you know what you end up with? Failure. They were not the true king. They look a lot like him in some small, isolated points. But they are not the true king, and that's not the true temple. A true king is going to come, and he's going to build a true temple, and we'll know it's a true temple the same way we knew the tabernacle was accepted and Solomon's temple was accepted, because God is going to fill it with himself. And that's what happened 2,000 years ago. The true son of David. Not only was he David's son, but he was David's Lord. According to Hebrews, he isn't part of the house, he is the house builder. The true king, King Jesus, came and built the true temple. And you say, well, where's the true temple? It's all around you. All those who enter into faith allegiance with Jesus are living stones composing the true temple of God. And how do we know that they're the true temple of God? Because he's filled them with his Spirit. This is what 1 John says. We know we're of God because his Spirit is in us. And he has filled it with himself. And that's why Jesus says, this temple of rocks, that's not going to stand. That's not the temple. They're trying to recapture David and Solomon's glory. But one greater than David and Solomon is here. And he's building a greater temple, where God is not taking everyone to heaven, where he is coming down and filling his creation once again. He is once again among us because he's filled his temple. So this is the story that Chronicles is telling. And when you read at the end where Nolan read, David has finally basically come to the end of his part of the project. He's gotten all the stuff together. He's got it all ready. Through his sin of counting the people, he ends up buying the land where the temple was to be built. That's why that sin is recounted, because that's what led to him buying the land where God wanted the temple to be built. And he's got the land, he's got all the building supplies, he's got all the blueprints, and they basically, in chapter 29, have a groundbreaking ceremony full of praise and worship and anticipation that they are going to enter into a new phase of their relationship with God. That's where Chronicles ends there. And in a couple weeks, we'll look at the second part of the book. Please stand with me as we close in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise you, we worship you. You alone are mighty and glorious. We thank you that you are so kind to us, that you don't overwhelm us more than we could handle. But we ask that you would each day just make yourself and your presence more real in our life. Keep pushing us to the boundary of our comfort. I ask that you would keep pushing us right to the edge where we are just wholly terrified of you and yet full of love. And you're so gentle, you're so kind, you're so careful with that, wanting to draw us into you and not frighten us away. And we're so grateful. You know how to do this. We ask, Father, for those that feel far away from you, that you through your Spirit right now would just speak to them in a way that just a still small voice, that they would sense that you're right there in their midst, that you're in their life, that they are part of that temple, that they are part of you, they are in you and you in them. Comfort them, draw them to you more each day. We thank you for your word, and we especially thank you for your Son, Jesus, our Lord.